Hi. So first I'll start from lots of Mazal Tov and many thanks. And I'm going to present two studies that I recently did together with Noam. And I'll focus on one paper titled Auctions Between Regret Minimizing Agents. And we're going to talk about settings in which several users interact over some online platform. These users are assisted by automated agents that play and optimize on their behalf. And the types of games we look at are online auctions, similar to those used by the large internet companies to sell ad positions online. And an important, well-known example are the keyword auctions that sell ad positions on search results web pages, like the one we see here on the right. And the way this very basically works is that every time a user enters some search query into the search engine, then the platform runs an auction between all the advertisers who bid for a keyword that is relevant for this query. And the bid of an advertiser is the maximum amount he's willing to pay for a click on his ad. And then the auction sets the allocations of ad positions and the payments for the players. And as we know, this is a huge industry. And these auctions run at very fast rates. So for some keywords, it can be thousands of auctions per second, sometimes even more. And because it's so fast, it's not very practical, perhaps not even possible to actually manually place a bid in each and every auction. And most of the bids are being placed by various types of automated bidding tools or auto bidding. And the way this basically works is that users enter their key parameters into the auto bidding agent interface. And then these agents automatically place bids, interact, and learn. And users can observe their long-term outcomes from a long series of auctions. So here is one example of a user interface. In this example, the user enters the maximum allowed bid for its agent. It doesn't mean that necessarily the agent is going to use this value as his bid, of course, but this is the maximum. So to illustrate this, let's say that Alice and Bob are two users in such an online platform. So in the classic auction setting, without automated bidding, each one of them is going to place a bid in each and every auction. And then the auction is going to return the allocations and payments. And then Alice and Bob are going to have some utility from these allocations and payments. And this will go on repeatedly. Now, the auto bidding setting is a bit different. Here, Alice and Bob provide parameters to their bidding agents. And these agents are going to place bids in a long sequence of auctions. And Alice and Bob are going to observe the long-term outcomes from this series of auctions. And they're going to have some utility from these long-term outcomes. And what's actually happening in this gray box here is that every bidding agent runs some learning algorithm, some online learning algorithm that aims to optimize the utility for its user. But it optimizes according to the parameters that were entered by the user. And we're going to focus on the situation, on the case where these parameters are the valuation per click of the users. And so you can notice that the auction that Alice and Bob observe is not exactly the underlying auction that was designed by the platform. Instead, they see what we call a meta-auction, in which the action spaces of the users are the possible parameters that they can give to their bidding agents. And the utilities are determined according to the dynamics between these agents in the repeated auction. And I'll just mention now, and I'll say a few more words about it towards the end of the talk. And this metagame model is, in fact, more general. You can think about it in other settings as well. And we do that in a companion paper. So the general model is that we have users. They give parameters to algorithms. And then we have a fixed set of algorithms that use these parameters. And the utilities for the users are determined according to the dynamics between these agents. So we think it's an interesting model, opens many interesting questions. And the types of agents, going back to our auctions, we're going to look at a regret minimizing agents, and we're going to look at regret with respect to a fixed action, so external regret. So these agents play such that their long-term average empirical payoffs approach the payoffs of the best fixed strategy in hindsight. And there are many well-known algorithms that have this regret minimization property, multiplicative weights, followed the perturbed leader, many others. And importantly, it has been shown that real-world bids in these ad auctions are by large consistent with this regret minimization model. So this is perhaps going to be perhaps a reasonable assumption to make about our bidding agents. And it's also known that no-regret dynamics approach the set of course-correlated equilibria of a game. In fact, by definition, if all the agents have low regret, then their joint empirical distribution of play is close to some course equilibrium. But it's also known that in many games, the set of course equilibria can be quite large, and different course equilibria can give different utilities. And so also in our auction, this set may be too large to analyze quantities of interest like the player's utilities. And recall that our motivation here is to be able to say something about the utilities for the users. So we need to actually figure out, to look into the dynamics and see what's going to happen, what utilities they're going to get in the long term. And we're going to look at second price auctions and first price auctions. In the perhaps the simplest model you can think about, we're going to have in the repeated auction a single identical item that is sold in every auction. Each bidder has a fixed value, V, for winning this item. Bidders are going to place bids, and the auction will determine the winner and the payment P. And the utility for a bidder is just V minus P if he wins, or 0 otherwise. And you can think about any tie-breaking rule in case of equal bids. And utilities are going to be additive over the auctions. And the important point, bidding agents are going to calculate their utilities and optimize with the values that are reported by the users, because this is the value that the algorithm knows. So what do we know about these auctions? Of course, the second price auction, well known that it's dominant strategy incentive compatible. So here, perhaps it would be natural to expect that we are going to get the second price outcome, where the agent with the higher value is going to always win and is going to pay the second price. Now, the first price auctions are not incentive compatible, but it is known that their equilibria give the second price outcome. But on the other hand, it has been shown that this auction has a course-correlated equilibria that give different outcomes. So here it's less clear what we should expect. Are we going to get, specifically, are we going to get the second price outcome or not? And the questions we are going to ask are, first, what are going to be the outcomes when these learning agents play these auctions, specifically these regret minimizing agents? And second, what should the users do? And specifically, is it in the best interest of a user to truthfully report his value to his own learning agent? And as I said, to answer these questions, we'll need to dive deeper into the dynamics to be able to actually characterize the meta game, the meta auction that these users observe. Okay, and we're going to see that the first point here is not correct. We are not going to get the second price outcome in the second price auction. Whereas the second point here, the answer is yes, we are going to get the second price outcome in the first price auction. So this is a result we found quite surprising when we analyzed these auctions. And of course, there are lots of related work on dynamics and learning and equilibria in repeated games, regret minimization, and other related topics. So I won't go into details here in favor of time, but you can read more about that in the paper. And let's start from a result on the second price auction. So the result I'm going to show now is talking about the agents. So it's looks a bit technical about where do the dynamics converge. So we'll start from talking about the agents, and then we'll see what are the implications for our users. So a result here says that a second price auction in the limit empirical distribution of multiplicative weights agents that play this auction with two different values. The agent with the higher value is going to bid uniformly between the second price and his value. And the agent with the lower value is going to bid with full support between 0 and the second price, which is his value, and with monotone density, with higher probability for the higher bids in this support. And so the high agent is going to always win the auction, but he's going to pay strictly less than the second price. So we're not getting the second price outcome. And we can see this also in simulations. So here we have a simulation of two multiplicative weights agents with values of 1 and 1/2. And we see on the left the bids over time. And the solid lines show running window averages over 100 auctions. So we see that indeed the high agent always wins in these auctions, except for a small number of auctions in the beginning. And we also see that the bids of the low agent are on average much lower than the second price of 1/2 here. So this 0.27 is in fact going to be the average payment for the high agent. So it's much less than the second price. And on the right, we see the empirical bid densities for the two agents. So indeed, the high agent bids uniformly between the second price and its value, and the low agent bids with full support between 0 and the second price with monotone density. Question?
So for these simulations, did you discretize the possible bids, or do you
Yes. Yes. The bids question was if bids in these simulations are discretized, so the answer is yes. In these simulations, we have values up to 1, and the bids are 1 over 1,000. This is the epsilon grid, is 1 over 1,000.
Same for the three of them, or also for continuous?
We use discretized bids. Yes. But the result remains even if this epsilon becomes very small, so it doesn't really matter much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you assuming anything about the overgraph algorithm itself, like the starting point or the
Starting point, no.
or the way it changes the?
Here the theorem talks about a multiplicative weights agent, so it's a specific algorithm. So in a different result, we talk about a broader family of no-regret algorithms. So in fact, if you want,
You could start at the second price, and that would be no regret all the way.
if they start and okay, if they had but the algorithm has to have this multiplicative weights algorithm has to have a full support in the beginning. Otherwise, there are no updates. So we can talk about it also offline. If you want to say something about general no-regret algorithms, then you encounter some problems because there are very weird dynamics that do not converge. So, okay. So yes, this is on multiplicative weights. And yeah.
I'm wondering, suppose you have 3 players and same setup. Would it be correct? I'm trying to kind of extrapolate from this here. Would it be correct that indeed the winner would bid a uniform distribution between the second highest to his own valuation, but all others would be uniformly up to the second highest, namely people would be higher than their valuations?
The intuition sounds to me correct, but we didn't analyze this case. But I think the top 2 players are the ones that matter. So this is why intuition sounds right, but I can't say a concrete answer.
Exponential weights is very similar to quantum response equilibrium.
Okay.
You're basically exponentially responding to chaos. But quantum response equilibrium, the limit as the parameter goes to infinity, converges to Nash equilibrium. And so it seems like a reason why you're not getting convergence to Nash equilibrium here might be the fact that you put a no overbidding assumption on.
Already Nash.
Yeah.
Look, you convert to anything. Quantum response converts to one of them.
But quantum is used to respond to the immediate previous, not the whole history, right? So
No, quantum response is a static concept.
correct. If you just like the immediate response to the whole history, what the quantum case.
I'm not sure about what to say about quantum response, but unfortunately, I won't have time to show the proof, but it does, it's a result of what happens in the learning dynamics, because after some point, the agent the low agent starts to always lose, and his bidding distribution freezes. So I'll be happy to talk about it more offline later on. So, okay, we see also similar, I'll just say shortly, similar results with different types of algorithms, not only multiplicative weights. So on the left, we see a slightly different variant of multiplicative weights, the hedge. And on the right, we see follow the perturbed leader. In the center, it's follow the perturbed leader with some added recency bias. So we see similar types of results. So now let's look what does this mean for our users. So from the perspective of our users, they enter their parameters and they see that they're not getting the second price outcome. So the corollary is that the second price outcome, the second price auction with multiplicative weight agents is not incentive compatible. And we can see this also in an example. Let's say that Alice has a true value of 0.4 and Bob has a true value of 0.5. And let's assume that Bob is going to give the true parameter to his agent. So now what should Alice do in this case? So if Alice is going to use her true value, then we know that her agent is going to always lose the auction, and Alice is going to get 0 utility. But if, on the other hand, Alice decides to manipulate her own learning agent by misreporting her value as a higher value of 1, then her agent is going to always win in the auction. And in fact, we're going to get exactly these dynamics that we saw. And she's going to get positive utility. So we see that truthful declarations by the users are definitely not a dominant strategy here. And in fact, they're not even an equilibrium. And this is very much in contrast to the basic intuition we would have on a second price auction. And we can also look at different manipulations that Alice can do. So here we have the same example, but now Alice is using different value manipulations for agent, different values x. And we see in green the utility for Alice, and in blue the utility for Bob. And we see that as long as the declaration that Alice uses is less than 1/2, her agent always loses, and she has 0 utility. If Alice just uses a value that is just above 1/2, her agent always wins, but she pays too much. So she has negative utility. But as she exaggerates her value even more, then she starts getting a positive utility. And now we can ask, maybe Bob can do something. So maybe Bob can improve his situation here. And we can ask what's going to be the equilibrium of this metagame. The metagame is the case where every user gives a parameter, so it's a one-shot game between them. The utilities are determined by the dynamics. So I won't go into details here, but it turns out that there are many equilibria. And in these equilibria, one user uses a very high value for his agent, and the other user uses a value that is not too high. So the interesting point here is that we see that there are inefficient equilibria of the meta game, of the meta auction, like the one we saw where Alice always wins. And from the point of view of the auctioneer, of the platform, the revenue can be anything in this range of equilibria between 0 and the first price. So this is a huge range, and these results are very much in contrast to what we are used to think on second price auction. It should be efficient and should give the second price as the revenue. Okay, so now let's look at the result for first price auctions. So for the first price auction, we showed that in a first price auction between any two mean-based regret minimizing agents. And mean-based learning algorithms are a family of algorithms. It includes many natural algorithms, also multiplicative weights. It was defined in this paper cited here. So if the dynamics converge to some distribution, then in this distribution, the high agent always wins, and he pays the second price. So we are getting the second price outcome. And again, we see this in simulations. So on the left, we see a simulation like the one before, but here it's the first price auction. And we see that the bids, that the high agent always wins, again, except for a small number of auctions in the beginning. And his bids converge to the second price of 1/2. On the right, we see a different simulation with symmetric agents, both with a value of 1. And here convergence is much slower. In the inset, you see 1,000,000 auctions in logarithmic scale for the time. So convergence is slow, but the bids converge to the second price. So now, what does this mean from the point of view of our users? So when they need to report, when our users need to report their parameters to their agents, they see that they get the second price outcome after they give their report. So the first price auction with mean-based regret minimizing agents is incentive compatible. So this is, again, very much in contrast to what we used to think on first price auctions, and also in contrast to the result on the second price auction. And I won't show the proof, I'll just say the very general idea, is that first we define a refinement of the notion of coarse equilibria that we call quant-dominated. And in these equilibria, players do not play actions that are weakly dominated by any of their other actions, but only relative to the support of the opponent. And then we have a lemma that says that in any finite game, if the dynamics of mean-based agents converge to some coarse equilibrium, then it must be quant-dominated. So this is not just for auctions, and then we have another lemma that connects this back to our auction setting and says that in the first price auction, in any quant-dominated coarse equilibrium, the high player must always win and pay the second price. So this is the overall structure. And we also study generalized first price auctions, which are more complex dynamically, at least for the no-regret dynamics that we look at. And I'll just mention our results very briefly here. So first, we calculate the Nash equilibrium of this auction for the case of two players. Apparently, it wasn't known. And then we see that the dynamics of multiplicative weights agents do not converge anywhere near this Nash equilibrium. And then we characterize the empirical equilibrium that we do see. So here we don't have proofs, we don't have a full analysis. We have closed form formulas that describe very well what we see in simulations, different parameters. So this is empirical analysis. And then given this empirical convergence, we study the equilibria of the metagame between the users for the case of users with equal values. And we see that in these equilibria, one user uses a very high value for his agent, and the second user uses a value that is a bit more than half his true value. And everyone prefers to be the high bidder and get positive utility, but if both users are giving high values for their agents, they're going to overbid and pay too much and get negative utilities. So it's similar somewhat to the result we saw, equilibria we saw in the second price auction. And interestingly, these strategic manipulations lead to, in these equilibria, to significant collusion between the users. So the users manage to capture 89% of the total welfare, which leaves only a small fraction to the auctioneer. This is about 1/3 than what the auctioneer would get if the users would use the true values. So from the point of view of the auctioneer, of the platform, these strategic manipulations by the users may have significant implications for the revenue. Okay, In this point, I'd like to go back to the more general metagame model. So in a second paper, in a companion paper called How and Why to Manipulate Your Own Agent, we model these metagames for general settings. So I'll just remind again, the general model is that we have users, they give parameters to algorithms, then we have fixed set of algorithms that interact in some fixed underlying game. And the utilities for the users are determined according to the long-term outcomes. So in this paper, we define this model for general settings, and we study 3 classes of games that exhibit different phenomena of these metagames. For example, in dominant solvable games, we show that a player that has a dominant strategy has incentives to manipulate the parameter reports to his agent such that the agent will not play the dominant strategy. So this is similar to what we saw in the second price auction. And we also show examples where in equilibria of the metagame, we get cooperative outcomes. Where all the users have higher payoffs. And in Cournot competitions, I won't go into any details here, but also here we show that for most game parameters, users prefer to misreport their parameters to their agents. And there are 2 types of equilibria, one in which both players manipulate their parameters, but both lose. And different type of equilibria, one player has a manipulation that manages to actually drive the opponent out of the market, out of the game. And then this user gains and the other user loses. And in opposing interest games, which are games similar to matching pennies, we see an interesting phenomenon where both players prefer to misreport their parameters to their agents, but in equilibrium of these reports, they get exactly the same utility as they would get if they used the true parameters. So we see all these different types of phenomena happening, either everyone gains from manipulation, or everyone loses, or someone gains, someone loses, or everyone manipulates their agents and go back exactly to the same point as if they did nothing. So we think it's an interesting model and opens many interesting questions. And to conclude, so we talked about metagames between users of learning agents. We saw that these learning dynamics induce incentives for the users and induce metagames between the users. And these metagames can sometimes be very different from the original game. And about auctions, our results show the types of phenomena that can happen in the auto bidding world. So we saw that second price auctions may lose their incentive compatibility. We saw this for multiplicative weights. And first price auctions become incentive compatible, at least for a large class of regret minimizing agents. And there are many interesting directions for future work. 2 concrete open questions. First, do mean-based no-regret agents converge in the first price auction? So this was a condition in our result. We see that empirically they do, but this is an open question. There is one paper that managed to show that they do converge, only for the case of symmetric bidders with exactly the same value. But generally, it's an open question. And also analyzing no-regret dynamics in generalized first price auctions seems to be challenging. And of course, studying more metagames in other interesting settings, studying dynamics in other, perhaps more complex auctions, and maybe design better agents that do something better than just minimize regret. So thank you, and again, lots of mazal tov.
So we've already asked many questions, so in the interest of time, let's take this offline. Thanks again to Yoav.
Okay.